Our last session, and these all have been terrific. Our last session is going to be led by, or the main speaker is Inderpal Grewal. And she is a professor of women's, gender, and sexuality studies at Yale University. Her research interests include transnational feminist theory, gender and globalization, human rights, NGOs and theories of civil society, and theories of travel and mobility. She's the author of Transnational America, Feminisms, Diasporas, Neoliberalisms, and she's currently working on a book project on the relationship between feminist practice and security discourses. Discussing her presentation today, two faculty members from the University of Michigan. The first is Nancy Rose Hunt, who's professor of history and also professor of obstetrics and gynecology here at U of M. And also Sidonie Smith, who's the Martha Guernsey Colby Collegiate Professor of English and Women's Studies, and also the director of the Institute for the Humanities and a professor of Women's Studies here at U of M. So, welcome.
Thank you, Ken, and thank you to the organizers for such an exciting day. I'm especially delighted also to have two interlocutors whose work I have admired for a long time, so I'm looking forward to that. Okay, a quick, an important note, it's a different paper than the one on Katrina, because I thought this one worked better with the thematics of the day and the issue of translation. So this is another paper I've been writing for a while, and I thought that this would work very well for the symposium today. And this one's called Outsourcing Patriarchy, Honor Killings as Crime of Culture or Violation of Women's Human Rights. I've been interested for a long time in subjects who judge and designate. And in this paper, I examine how the millennial modern subject is created in related but divergent ways in the West and in India. I take it as a given, and I'm talking about honor killings which are horrific forms of violence that occur in order to control the sexuality of women, and this is the general view of this. Yet at what point and where does that violence get named as a specific human rights violation? Right? One that is called honor killings, in which honor comes to have a certain kind of meaning. And what does it then become productive of, is what I'm asking. The Global Feminist Project produced an essential understanding of patriarchy as either the same globally or structurally. And now this understanding has given way to thinking about gender as uneven and contingent. Yet for analyzing some regions and cultures, patriarchy is seen as the source of human rights abuses against women, and it continues to be the preferred analytic, even as it is considered inadequate for understanding other regions. My paper then investigates the phenomena that the research on patriarchy continues to describe some parts of the world, but not others. And I argue that this is a process of outsourcing patriarchy, that is, producing value by moving it outside the West, the United States in this case, and that this process occurs in related ways in India as well to produce new global modern urban subjects of the new Indian economy. Outsourcing as metaphor then indexes the participation of corporate and transnational media in this process and the value that is extracted from such a project. Feminist debates over honor killings are ongoing and vexed, and the use of the analytic of patriarchy continues to inform research on violence against women in, for instance, many parts of the world. For some scholars, it's important to see honor killings as an example of human rights violation of women marked by an Agamben-like bare life. In such analyses, honor killings emerge as actions of a patriarchy based on notions of honor, which continue on as it's often called tribal or traditional forms. Laila Abu Lughod has recently provided a trenchant analysis of this use of honor crimes as Muslim crimes, showing that in key anthropological and popular narratives, as well as in human rights documents and in NGOs produced by Amnesty Human Rights Watch, the term, she argues, is deeply ideological. As she states in these texts, Western society and integrated immigrants seem to have a monopoly on liberal and human values embodied in free sexuality and personal autonomy. In doing so, she argues, they ignore illiberal values that exist in the West, even as they are unable to examine how honor exists as a complex social value that permeates women's and men's life in multiple registers in the Middle East. This is an important and critical corrective to this debate. While Abu Lughod is interested in examining the circulations of honor killings as a concept in the West and among elites in the Middle East, I examined the media coverage of this concept in India and the West. However, I focus on how the notion circulates in divergent ways, both in relation to a pervasive anti-Muslim sentiment that remains embedded in a Hindu-majority culture in India, but also to ideologies of emerging media and its political economy. The term honor killings, I would say, has circulated not simply because NGOs and human rights groups have brought these to light, but because the term has the power to diagnose the nature of crime and its law and order solution as being linked and confined to some particular societies following a racial logic. It proposes an analysis of power, its exercise, and the cause of the crime as this culture. There's little examination here of the history of media in which such cultures and crimes are produced, defined, circulated, and understood. The identification of violence, and this kind of violence, gendered violence, as honor killing, may even foreclose an analytic that might be more historicized, as Abu Lughod argues, multifaceted or conflictual, or one that may examine the productions of subjects of contemporary media cultures. The use of the term suggests a notion of cultural difference that has been based for a long time on a history of academic social science research in North America and Europe, as well as in the Middle East and Asia. At this point, I would argue the term exists in a field of transnational overdeterminations. The complex of honor, as it has been understood within anthropological research, is believed to be the features of particular societies, mostly located in some of the long history of this research, mostly located in the Mediterranean, the Middle East and South Asia. But what is striking about much of the contemporary literature on honor is that this has moved from an attribute of behavior in the Mediterranean to merely to Muslim and Middle East countries. So the sort of Mediterranean has dropped out here. For those scholars who struggle against the ahistorical formulations but wish to retain the notion of honor killings as a crime, it is racism and immigrant communities in Europe that are considered to be conflict when these happen in the diaspora. And they argue that this is only because the process of immigration and a racist host culture makes them more traditional. So these are folks that are trying to push against the very racial ideology of it. Yet even these scholars who wish to see diasporic honor killings as an attribute of the racism that people experience in Europe or the West, even they cannot examine why this term has mostly come to be used in describing violence mostly within Muslim communities, be they in Europe or the Middle East, and why the notion of a Mediterranean culture of honor has fallen out. Much of this research relies, of course, on divisions between tradition and modern societies to implicitly suggest that modern societies are not honor societies. So if this does concern diasporic and mobile societies, it demarcates between immigrant and host cultures. Thus, modern man, we assume, is not motivated by something called honor. And so patriarchal violence and control of women by families exists in those zones elsewhere in time and place. But some of the feminist research which engages with post-colonial theory is concerned with understanding how patriarchy continues into the present moment, as well as arguing against these colonial ideologies. This research sees honor as a complex phenomena, and some of the scholars who work on this, Diane King, Laila Abu Lughod, they have tried to show this as a historical and complex formation. They push against the tendency, even in anthropology, to suture the term honor to a crime rather than to behavior, even to masculinity. Yet, despite the work of these scholars, the term has come to have a new life in journalism and contemporary media cultures. In these mediated sites, honor killings refer not simply to the cause of death, but to the cause of death and violence as the work of a patriarchy. And here's where I would argue that if the term patriarchy itself has become sort of obsolete and outmoded in a great deal of feminist theory to describe what's going on in the West, it has remained alive to describe many other parts of the world, especially Middle East Muslim communities. In particular, then, societies that see themselves as liberal may retain male power, but they deny that it is patriarchy. So patriarchy is both disavowed and outsourced by such liberalism. Violence against women is blamed on individual criminality rather than culture. It is here that honor killings as a human rights issue emerges by seeing culture and state as responsible for the violence, but identifying individuals as victims. So it works within the discourse of human rights very easily. And in India, of course, there are many human rights groups that are working to eradicate what they argue is a proliferation of honor killings. In the US and across transnational media, English language media in particular, and I did a search which pulled up over 900 entries from the US, UK, Pakistan, Middle East, etc. Honor killings are represented to be the work of Muslim cultures, which nurtures this kind of patriarchy. Often, though, and especially in the context of the UK, to diagnose honor killings within diasporic communities, Muslim and South Asian are often collapsed. So we have Sikh communities, Hindu communities, all believed to be having the same patriarchy. And elsewhere, it's only believed to be Muslim communities that have it. So there's a lot of sort of toing and froing of this kind of notion of patriarchy. So often, though, Muslim and South Asian are collapsed in an example of the problem of locating the crime within a culture, since religion and culture are constantly being collapsed together in particular ways. All of the references to this term in the context of the UK, for instance, and the US, that is the English language press, use it in reference to the killings of young women of Muslim or South Asian or Middle East descent. And in part, the numbers of these articles simply mean that many of them are repeated. So when you look at hundreds of these articles across any LexisNexis search, the same news bulletin will be repeated over and over again, and this is also because the media is connected. There are newswire services that circulate the stories. There are transnational corporations that own media corporations that are, own organizations and across, Asia and the U.S. and the West. And the numbers of these articles simply mean that they are repeated. Of those articles that are not about Muslim majority countries, most concern either Muslim or South Asian diasporas, right, where young girls are presumed to have been killed by family members. In a couple of articles, perhaps 2 or 3 that I noticed out of the hundreds that I looked at, some community members protest the use of the term honor killings, asking that they be seen as domestic violence instead. But these few voices are drowned out by the overwhelming circulation of the culturalist narratives. The news reports of these honor killings in the UK, for instance, has mobilized a broad apparatus of governance and anti-immigrant discourse that calls itself as concerned with multiculturalism. If honor killings come to index the patriarchy of racial others that has come to Europe via immigration, it makes possible a denunciation of these cultures in the name of protection of women. From immigration tests in which young women are to testify they did not have forced marriage, to welfare agencies focused on sheltering young South Asian women, to policing mechanisms, there's a broad array of technologies of governance that have come into existence in response to honor killings. But what of places outside the West? In the summers of 2009, 2010 in India, and I was in New Delhi at the time, the English newspapers are full of stories of honor killings. Kap panchayats, we are told, informal, local, village, and upper caste-based organizations are responsible for enabling and abetting these murders. Young people who are murdered seem to be young couples or women who have crossed caste lines or sort of kinship lines, people who are forbidden to marry each other, to marry lower castes or Dalits, or have runoff with cousins or partners or neighbors from groups deemed to be off limits for marriage. The papers report that fathers, brothers, and mothers of these young people, mostly of the girls or women, are responsible for these murders. Human rights NGOs are using CEDAW as a way to bring these issues to the public and to the state, but in fact, the criminalization approach has come to become very powerful. The Lok Sabha, the lower house of parliament, is considering legislation against honor killings that would criminalize families involved in such murders. The Supreme Court is seeking ways to codify honor killings as a separate crime that should be punished by the death sentence. And the Home Ministry is planning changes to criminal penalties in the Indian Penal Code. Tracking reports in one newspaper, which is a pan-Indian newspaper, English language, Hindustan Times, through a database, I find that new articles, a coverage of honor killings increases dramatically over the years since 2000. From focusing on news reports of such violence in Pakistan or its tribal regions, and this is the earlier few sporadic reports on honor killings, the newspapers shift to talking about how honor killings are found within Indian and Hindu communities in India as well. In the news media, as I've said, most of the blame is ascribed to the work of the caste panchayats, the Kap panchayats. These are upper caste-based, village-level, informal groups, and predominantly male, that police the boundaries of caste through gender and sexuality. Even as newspapers also mention such incidents occur in the southern part of India or in urban locations where Kap panchayats do not exist, the predominant explanation and the blame is attributed to the caste patriarchy as the perpetrators of the crime. Yet this visibility of the Kap panchayats has paradoxically given them visibility and agency. They have become more and more prominent in the newspaper as a constituency, even though they were informal. They have become visible as a locus of political power, even if they do not have any recognizable standing as representative bodies at the village level. Prem Chowdhury, in her work on Haryana, which is another region where these honor killings are presumed to take place in great numbers, has examined the history of this and has argued that the contemporary moment has forged a new notion of honor among rural elites who feel threatened by changes brought about by new globalization. Her work has contributed to understanding how honor is being used to control women's sexuality in both cities and villages. Her focus, however, on property, the laws of property, and the Hindu Succession Act, which allowed women and mothers and widows to inherit ancestral property, and its amendment in 2005, which gave daughters equal rights as sons, also alters the view of honor both as simply culture or tradition, and it makes honor as much about economic transactions as about any idea of culture. At the same time, the focus on a particular regional group does not accord with the many cases of honor killings mentioned in the media, some of which also concern those outside in the south of India as well. That all these different motives and cases, property, sexual control, crisis of masculinity, emergence of notions of individuality and choice, consumption, class interests, caste power, et cetera, can be understood through the notion of honor is, I would argue, somewhat debatable. In Pakistan and India, human rights groups and feminist groups have been active in identifying honor crimes as an example of the violence of the state on women, and this is how they incorporate it into human rights frameworks. But some scholars are more cautious, suggesting that while the category of honor killings can be seen as ethnographic, a part of ethnographic violence, it occurs because the post-colonial state is patriarchal, with a fractured modernity that is visible in the collaborations and conflicts between the center, the state, and the communities, with the upshot that the state is unwilling and unable to help women. Yet the notion of honor, I would argue, has other genealogies if we consider the issue of media and its globalization in contemporary India. In the context of a globalized media, law and order is a spectacle. The news presents honor killings as the real story behind the murders of young women, despite reports any other evidence to the contrary. The news reporting is supported in the opinion pages of these news dailies by writers who create a distinction first between an India, a modern India of human rights and empowered women, and a Pakistan that lacks these, thus producing a kind of difference between what they see as a modern India, advancing India, and a pre-modern Pakistan, and between different kinds of patriarchies, which are then tied to the concerns of a powerful Hindu nationalism. Yet there is a second set of differences that are articulated between urban and rural, between the emerging urban India of NGOs and cosmopolitan and global subjects, and an India of rural patriarchy and poverty. The problem of continuing inequalities in India across gender, sexuality, caste, and religion is ignored then by containing the problem within one region or caste, or by seeing it as a rural problem, in which the national modern, as Tejaswini Niranjana calls it, is its new mode as a global modern is absolved of its participation in such violence. Even if there are those who disagree that honor killings are caused by notion of honors, they still believe that it comes from an old order determined to keep sexual control through repressing individual freedom, commonly figured as romantic love or love by marriage by choice. In addition, the use of human rights as moral panic discourse is also being used by Hindu nationalist groups to foment anti-Muslim hate by accusing Muslims of luring Hindu girls to elope with them. The distinction between rural and urban becomes visible to readers of this new media. For instance, in Times of India, another news daily, a blog in response to an article on honor killings says, like the scourges of dowry and female feticide a generation ago, even though that isn't a generation ago, honor killings seem to be spreading to new areas. Not long ago, we thought that such barbarism belonged to remote tribal reaches of Pakistan. Most of us are baffled by this phenomenon. This is so much at odds with the new India we hope and dream about. Another Times of India article in 2010 begins with describing the Kap Panchayats as the Taliban-style caste panchayats. Although news dailies are politically divergent, they all seem to use the term, and actually even the Hindi language dailies use the term, they just write honor killings in Hindi. So they haven't developed a different term about it. Even the Hindi language newspapers use the term, suggesting both its English language provenance and its power to circulate. That this is a discourse that is understood to be proliferating is clear. The reports all provide a sense that this violence is increasing with the new globalization of the Indian economy. What is clear then, that new ways of spectacularization of particular bodies has become visible. The newspapers have moved from earlier decades of ignoring violence against women that pervades all aspects of urban, rural, new, old India to focusing, one, on rape, and its spectacle to present now honor killings as a singular crime whose cause is identifiable and therefore can be addressed. But the news media is used to following trends rather than presenting news and ideas that are unrelated to popular interest. That means only a few types of crimes get attention. And even if they do get attention, the analysis is often very sensational. I ascribe the use of terms such as honor killings to both the pervasive circulation of the concept in transnational media in relation to the kind of notion of patriarchal Muslim cultures, the globalization and expansion of media in the context of the emergence of India as a new global power and as a modern nation. Furthermore, anti-Muslim sentiment, however, is not a new phenomenon in India, evidenced by the widespread discrimination and impoverishment of Muslim communities. In the last 2 decades, right-wing Hindu parties have encouraged such sentiments and also initiated pogroms against Sikhs, for instance, and Muslims. Ignoring the anti-Muslim genealogy of the term, the media productions of honor killings mark a difference then between middle-class metropolitans who see themselves as modern and a barbaric rural patriarchy that they believe enables these crimes. The spatial divide between rural and urban India has become a temporal one. The urban areas in most of these news accounts are spaces where these couples elope to escape from violence, generally from rural areas, and they find refuge in urban sites, but are often brought back to the rural village by force. In an India where the economy is booming, where social and cultural divisions are changing, What is outside this liberalized global economy as its media circulations has become tradition, archaic, rural. In this new modernity, Islamophobia can be circulated as characteristic of another nation and state, rather than as endemic within India. What is clear then is that the concept of honor and tradition is being recuperated in these stories, even as these notions are being increasingly seen as forms of backwardness, akin to caste identity itself, which has to be disavowed. The media, the very powerful new media in India, the cable channels, the 24/7 news media, etc., which have emerged over the last couple of decades, and the expansion of media in print, television, and a long history of cinema and the internet have become vehicles of this progress and much of the media sees itself as outside caste and tradition. The increased use of the term honor killing signals the rise of this media, transnationally connected and increasing in reach and clout. Arvind Rajagopal has pointed out that English language dailies have become more powerful because the language of global India is English and it's dominated by upper castes, which are often, he argues, not always well informed on historical or domestic issues. Scholars suggest that the Indian news media is controlled for the most part by those educated in Europe or North America, with virtually all high caste editors, with almost no Dalits. They ignore their own caste identities but vilify Dalit groups organizing around the discrimination that's based on caste. They focus mostly on the state and its failures and on law and order solutions or government corruptions rather than interrogating how urban and rural cultures are infused with gender and caste inequities that remain unaddressed. Right? The media itself, then, after the end of state control, has become a sign of progress. India shining, this empowered India, is its ideology. With this new expanded media that has emerged, as Kalpana Sharma has pointed out, a frenzy of crime coverage in both newsprint and television. Crimes committed against middle class and middle and upper classes receive much greater attention than crimes against working class or Dalit women. An interest in honor killings is an example of this bias. Often crime coverage is simply replicating police handouts and can be sensationalized, and this means that a term such as honor killings becomes very convenient when police are investigating murder of a young woman or a young couple that can require little other investigation. For instance, lack of attention to the economic issues in the case of rural families remains a major lacuna in the narrative of honor killings, especially as control of property remains in the hands of men. Such economic rights issues are seldom seen as human rights violation, so that such aspects of violence in family is often ignored. Honor killings as a media staple also works well within the genre of narrative of crimes in cinema and television. The crime show, and we see many of those from the West that circulate across cable TV, and its genealogy in the detective novels suggest why such a concept has power. Feminist media and literature scholars recognize that both the crime and the detective are the products of forms of power that continue to produce patriarchy as powerful. Detection provided the satisfaction of closure and was the product of powerful notions of colonial science, policy, and race. And within a long history of print culture, it has continuities with new visual popular media. The media spectacle is also important here, and the spectacle of such violence can be linked to the pervasiveness of the cinema of crime and revenge in Bollywood as well, right? So Indian cinema has a long history of the spectacle of rape, for instance, and the discourse of the protection of women. And the spectacle of the crime show on television and combines with those. So there's a lot of circulation of crime and law and order narratives. For violence that is ongoing, caused by multiple factors and their convergences, honor killings as a term, as a convenient term for this, produces an easy upper caste and class and racial answer to continuing violence. If honor killings are understood as a human rights abuse against women by multiple local and international NGOs, the Indian state sees it as a crime that has a law and order solution. So even the human rights organizations all seek these law and order solutions. And such a solution produces audiences in the context of the burgeoning of crime as a subject of visual cultural productions, both in India and the West. Viewer becomes detective in the television genre of the crime show or the police in the Bombay tradition that started in the 70s and 80s. And particular cultures are now criminalized in order to bring closure to the crime. Law and order are thus the coordinates through which it can be decoded, and the crime can be outsourced to place and times that are distant from the global modern subject. The viewer then joins with the state to utilize its sovereign powers to solve the crime. No further investigation is required then. No knowledge, as Prem Chowdhury has argued, of the multiple economic arrangements in which errant young people can be disposed of lest they claim their rights. And certainly the problem of transnational anti-Muslim violence can be easily localized as a cultural problem that modernity can solve. Thank you.
I'm going to stand to break with precedent here. Many thanks for the opportunity to read this fascinating paper. As you've all just heard, it's about the use of the two-worded term honor killings to spectacularize and primitivize. The paper moves from the use and circulation of the expression in various locations in the West to its use and circulation in South Asia. In the first geographic space, honor killings have come into play to label deaths and murders, and the term is used to point fingers at mostly Muslim immigrants from the Middle East and Asia. In the second set of instances, anti-Muslim sentiments, indeed phobia, combine with new, more urbane, cosmopolitan sensibilities of urban citizens, reporting journalists, and the police. In both cases, those using the term usually stand in a position of shock. They point and label with horror and outrage at the other. The paper suggests that these two kinds of uses and their locations are interlinked. Indeed, that it is a global transnational media that has partly intensified and continues to intensify the circulation of the term and the sentiments of horror, outrage, sometimes even hate. It's also suggested that a reductive, reifying kind of anthropology is responsible for the term honor that precedes the word killings. What is not clear from the evidence at hand is whether this word, which comes out of this mediatized lexicon and whose semantic range embraces honor, dignity, pride, and its opposites, words like shame, humiliation, and anger, whether that term honor might ever be translated into a useful conceptual or analytic lexicon, or if it is getting translated into a vernacular location in any of these places where these so-called honor killings are happening. So a vernacular lexicon that's at play in households, sites of distraction, the streets, and that speaks about these same murders or deaths in a way that is perhaps not using this same othering language. I came away with a sense that everything in this paper is connected to everything else in one big, complex, and tangled web. And I think that's perhaps a conscious intention of the piece. But what I am trying to do here a bit is to untangle some of the analytic and empirical strands a bit more for the issues that we have at play here at this conference, and to kind of pull things in a different direction that move well beyond the intentions of Inderpal and a beautiful paper that she put together for us, but for the purposes of what we're doing here. This conference is about human rights, the bodies of evidence used in making claims or accusations in relation to violations of human rights, and the ways such claims or rights or accusations are translated or are mistranslated in the process. So we've got a wonderful case here of mistranslation happening over and over again. So I want us to think about what the bodies of evidence are that were used in this paper. Mostly it's journalistic reporting in newspapers, blogs, and websites. There's also some scholarly writing, and there's also a lot about cinema and film. Sometimes I think the evidence is shifting scales and putting us on a more, what I would call, experiential and less mediated ground. Now, there's maybe a whole debate to have with a media specialist about whether one can ever be on experiential ground that's not mediated. So I'm willing to, I'd be happy to go there. But let me keep going. Do we glimpse lives or moments when the evidence seems less distorted or reduced by a journalistic form of production? Of course, Grewal's point precisely is about these distortions and reductions, but the vantage point of those sitting in human rights NGO offices in India or Sweden, for example, they never quite come into view here, but can she bring some of them into view for us? Nor do we get quite the view of the arresting police officers, the media producers, or the consumers. So, and nor, most important, of what I would call the implicated subalterns, who are the other, at the end side of the other. There are places we almost never go in this paper, and my hunch is, again, that it's due to the kind of evidence and mostly to the disciplinary approach that's being brought to bear on the material. The paper beautifully opens up much complexity for our consideration, especially about transnational circulations in relation to the production of a hegemonic concept, honor killings, which is apparently used interchangeably with human rights violations by some actors, at least. But how hegemonic is it? I guess that is there room here to ask, is it always hegemonic? I'd like to wander for a second to some hypothetical places where a hypothetical anthropologist or historian with ethnographic sensibilities might conduct research and then carry readers to these places through their writing. Locations like inside the police station where some officers are chatting among themselves just before or after one of these honor killings is investigated, or inside the household where someone has been killed, inside the courtroom where the case is adjudicated, to a funeral, or to some of the mourning rituals. At any one of these locations, one might find, at least along their edges, people murmuring, I would guess, whether they use the word honor or not, about issues of loss and motivation and responsibility. Or we might try to go close to the journalist who's speaking about honor killings or is taking the photographs relating to honor killings, and if one was able to enter her or his vehicle before or after he or she does that work of capturing that spectacular footage that is going to be spectacularized in exactly the way that Inderpal points out for us, is it possible that one might still get some proximity and glimpse an individual actually aware of the simplifying that's going on inside these investigations, and who knows quite a bit about what's being omitted in the process, and is aware of the removal of complexity and subtlety. I think in our world it surely is. I think the David Turney presentation today was a really nice example of that. Most importantly for our purposes, could we send this hypothetical ethnographic student inside the offices of an NGO, or whether it's an NGO with a human rights orientation or an NGO with a feminist orientation, but that somehow sees these honor killings and human rights as part of their admit. If we got inside those kinds of locations, those what I would call more intimate or more experiential locations, what kind of translation and mistranslation work is happening there? including in relationship to yesterday's news, the news that got spectacularized or that the cosmopolitans are consuming in Delhi. As with any study of active translation of a lexicon as use, and especially in such a case focusing on tracking one pointed term or concept, it's important to think in terms of different levels, scales, and spaces where a term comes into play. Some of these might be historical spaces, so I was also interested to know more about the history of the English term honor killing. Is there an earlier killing that might be traced in a colonial genealogy? Was the term ever used by the British or by missionaries in relation to sati or widow burnings? And what kind of translation work happened out of vernacular languages and back into them again, never mind into other legal and humanitarian registers in the English language? The paper talks about human rights at numerous junctures. I want to see if we can get Inderpal to tell us a bit more about when and how the term honor killings gets used in the same sentence with human rights. When is it a question? Are they used interchangeably? And what kind of translational mode is happening between these two notions? And for who is doing it, for what kinds of purposes, and is it a language of human rights to point fingers, make claims, generate funds, carry out kinds of expert work in law, humanitarian social work, feminist activism, policing, and the like. So there's obviously a whole range of possible actors who might want to make those kind of interchangeable translations. One use splendidly well documented here is the primitivizing, spectacularizing use. This use makes use of the label for a death or homicide as a metonymic shorthand. An entire community is disparaged or belittled in the process, and the users or producers in this case rely on media technologies to do this work. The scale of dissemination is thus wide, and the shorthand is no doubt often combined with a set of visual images and perhaps disturbing sounds that together translate the expression honor killings into a set of meanings that move from barbaric to primitive to wrong. Inderpal's powerful point is that this shorthand combines with spectacular mediatized technologies and screens, and that these uses circulate and proliferate. The uses produce or enact quotation, citation, duplication, but I would assume they also produce or enact transformation, retranslation, or manipulation. Thus, another set of uses, a less hegemonic set, is perhaps at play, and so it's that piece that I would be wanting to send my dissertator to go and do more work for us now that I have heard this splendid paper. As an ethnographic historian, this is the body of evidence about use I would like to know more about. Gripping hold of the value of Grewal's insight, I'd be keen to send that student to watch television and watch web surfing inside the communities where an honor killing has allegedly happened, inside communities of spectators alongside the Delhi cosmopolitans, for example, and inside those communities of human rights activists and lawyers, or feminist activists and lawyers. And see the kinds of meanings people are making out of these insults and claims. When do they question the label? How do they retranslate it, refuse it? When do they condemn the term? And are human rights specialists also using this same shorthand as they collect bodies of evidence, not just to criminalize, but to affect change? So obviously it's a kind of counter discourse in part that I'm trying to get at here, but not entirely. Also the expert discourse, and to see what kinds of relationships there might be among them. So how are we best able to get to these bodies of evidence about translation and mistranslations of human rights shorthands within both vernacular and expert consciousness and speech? How can we combine that kind of analysis with the powerful kind of evidence that Grewal gives us on the way these same codes circulate within global and translational media as a profoundly pathologizing register that lands into everyday's lives, into policing operations, and no doubt into all kinds of immigrant community centers. Finally, I'd like to know, are there times when the use of the term honor killings becomes a kind of strategic essentialism? What are those times? When are those times? Clearly, the label enters as a gloss for a kind of death and reduces and pathologizes in the process. But when are those reductions politically useful, and to whom? I assume such a death would usually represent a complex knot of motivations, stigmatizations, and affects. When do these also warrant attention or lead to a productive kind of claim-making for change? Do Muslims in rural India or Pakistan ever find a way to hurl back the notion of honor killings against the state or against its cosmopolitans? Do Muslim women anywhere in the world ever use this shorthand to assert rights, to shame their men, to point to complex bundles of humiliation and anger? No one speaks about honor rapes as such in South Africa, but rape is discussed along a human rights register. But if one looks carefully at feminist political organizing in this context, women and men are prying open what we might call this honor box. At the same time, there is much anger about the belittling racialized media representations about the high incidence of rape in South Africa. There's a strong realization that the history of masculinity in this region has gone with profound humiliations and anger, and it's Black South African women who are pointing the way towards creating a public discourse about these negative emotions and their toxic and violent affects for the sisters and daughters and mothers of these same men who rape. Might there be a parallel within the world's many communities where the label honor killings surfaces and distorts? Might we find a way to pry open a small crack towards this kind of seeing, speaking, or translating anew? Whether against the grain or with the grain, it's this more ethnographic and anti-hegemonic body of evidence that I yearn for as a complement to this powerful paper. Ultimately, I think we might hear the subaltern speak if we stretch and try.
I'm the last presentation of the day, and I'll try and be short, and I'll be condensing as I'm going, so I don't go over my 8 to 10 minutes. Thank you for the pleasure of reading your paper, Inderpal, and allowing me to think about these issues for the last couple days very intensively. Outsourcing as metaphor enables Inderpal to track the ideological work that the discourse of honor killing does as it moves along national and transnational routes in the media's search of profits and value. Central to this discursive work is its mapping of the globe and of the nation as differentiated by zones of modernity and zones of tradition, as well as its production of the subject of modernity, a subject constituted through the everyday acts and practices of, as she says, disavowing the existence of patriarchy, even as gendered subordination and violence continue. This disavowal takes place in the viewing habits and the reading habits of people consuming popular genres of crime by culture. Taking up Inderpal's call for examination of the history of media in which such cultures and crimes are produced, defined, read, and understood, I want to raise a couple issues that extend Inderpal's provocative analysis. I'm going to do two things. I hope I have time for two things, and I'll cut it short if I don't. But first, I want to introduce the phrase insourcing witnessing to supplement the notion of outsourcing patriarchy. The outsourcing of patriarchy to elsewhere nations and to elsewhere pockets within the nation takes place through what we might call genres of secondary witnessing. The bodies of evidence are dead bodies. The stories of those dead bodies are circulated as genre in transnational media outlets, in print and online. They are, as Inderpal explores, newspaper reporting on crime, and the televisual genre of crime procedural. These are two genres of witnessing through which the imaginary of the traditional and modern organize image, sound, text, and production processes. Since personal narrative is my field, I want to think about another genre mobilized in campaigns in the West targeted at honor killing. One of the most pervasive and persuasive genres of witness in human rights campaigns have been first-person witness accounts, first-person narratives that have gained a lot of purchase in reading publics around the world. They are mobilized to put a human face on suffering. They call larger publics to attention and enlist them in the project of redressing harms. Witness narratives thus intensify the stakes of reading in the circuits of production, circulation, and reception through which they travel the globe. Reading becomes preparation for acts of rescue. It becomes rescue reading. And readers are situated as potential rescuers, if not in fact, that vicariously, and often they are solicited to be rescuers financially. This is a genre of communicative capitalism that is often lucrative for editors, publishers, and NGOs. I want to suggest how witnessing to this crime of culture is insourced in the developed world, in particular in cases in Europe, Australia, and the US. And I'm going to talk about a couple narratives of honor killing that have gotten a lot of attention in the West, although I can't talk about it in any detail. Among the best known of the recent Witness to Islamic Oppression memoirs is a book called, in English, it's called Burned Alive, originally entitled Brûlé Vive, published by the French publishing house O Editions in 2003 under the signature of Suad. Its jacket blurb proclaims it to be the first true account ever published by the victim of an honor killing, a paradoxical position to be in. The American translation had the subtitle, A Victim of the Law of Man, and it has a striking cover depicting a woman encased in a white mask that reveals only her glowing eyes. A publishing success, Burned Alive has sold over 100,000 copies. Now, the narrator, Suad, is a Palestinian woman who recounts the story of her growing up in a rural village as one of several daughters. She falls in love with a young man. She gets pregnant, and her father and brother, enraged at the assault on honor, set her on fire. In this testimony, Suad speaks as and it's a fake name. Suad speaks as a representative victim of honor killing on behalf of women threatened by death and mutilation at the hands of patriarchal perpetrators. And the text employs the binary moral grammar of human rights claims. And there's a whole paratextual apparatus that shores up this. There's a part of it, the text is written by a social worker who finds her in the West Bank and kind of takes her to Switzerland and helps her recover from this experience. But both despite and because of the layering of authenticating effects, Burned Alive has drawn suspicious readings and charges of fabrication. A searing critique has come from historian Therese Taylor, who describes it as a sensational drama of endless death, and she catalogs its documentary inconsistencies. She goes through it. Now, in addition to that, and the whole question of suspicious reading is a whole other area that I have to bracket when you talk about human rights narration. But in addition to the narrative's stereotypic projection of perpetrators, Burned Alive's problematic authorship raises troubling questions about who is actually speaking here. Because what you discover the more you look at this text, you have somebody named Suad whose name's on the cover, but you have a social worker whose text is interspersed with Suad's witnessing. And then you discover there's a ghostwriter, and you discover that this ghostwriter works for O Editions on a contract basis, and that she is well known as bringing forward testimonies by women of North African descent in France and women from other developing countries. So the unified I called Suad is really temporally, geographically, and ideologically a composite of several voices that share a specific purpose, to do some kind of witnessing and to circulate this notion of backwardness and of this, and do the work that Inderpal so powerfully explores of outsourcing patriarchy. And O Editions itself is a publishing house that has put out a lot of these texts. Now, the second one I want to note is one called, by Norma Curry, called Forbidden Love. I don't know whether any of you know this. This one was an outright fabrication. It's about an honor killing in Jordan. Before it was exposed as a hoax by newspapers in Australia, where it first came out, and by feminists in Jordan, Curry herself had become the spokesperson on behalf of victims of honor killing. But in a way, she's never said that she fabricated this. And the text has an afterlife because there's been a documentary about trying to get her to admit that she fabricated this text. So these are a couple of examples. And what's interesting is that in these cases, skeptical readings and scandals that arise around these stories of narratives of honor killing have the effect of disrupting comfortable protocols of reading. That is, they are suspect. They may even be fabrications, but they do some important work by disrupting the ease with which readers want to identify, want to see the women who are speaking as authentic victims. And I think that's really interesting, and it's important for the issues that Inderpal is tracking about how readers are constituted or how they might be kind of destabilized as readers. Now, the other thing I want to point to, and I can't, I think I'm getting close to my 10 minutes. The other thing I wanted to just point to, and we were talking about this earlier, which is to kind of ask a question about how the kinds of witnessing that's going on in the new media, social media, through remote sensing, through practices like hacking, how these are changing the kinds of narratives that might be produced around something called honor killing. And I'll just point to a couple ideas about what happens to personal stories in these environments. What happens on the internet is not an eyewitness storytelling in the traditional sense. That is not an extended narrative. E-witnessing, I like to call this, or my friend Kay Schaefer and I are calling this e-witnessing. E-witnessing, it involves a combination of texting, SMS, blog posts, tweets, podcasting, video clips, photos, links, and the like. It is witnessing without a singular agent of narration. It is an accumulation of fragmented contributions from many sources and from actors impelled by a diversity of motivations and desires. By the nature of the media, the focus is diffused and decentralized. Any individual contribution is placed in a constantly changing web of paratexts and surrounds, links, calls for action, information flows, and networks of reception. When organized through websites, its dynamic is less progressive than recursively interactive, as users contribute more commentary or information or photographic evidence. And we could go on and on about kind of what these new meetings, what effect they have. It's as if there's a story without a victim. And virtual audiences are themselves undefinable and fragmented. So e-witnessing may or may not coalesce into any claim of a collective identity or a sense of solidarity. So for me, these two examples of hoaxing and the impact of these new media raised the questions about how different genres and how new media environments might be mobilized both to outsource patriarchy, but also to interrupt the logic of outsourcing. So I'll stop there.
Well, thank you both for terrific comments and good questions. The paper was a way to think about how the subjects of modernity are produced. And so just responding to Nancy's questions, the kind of vernacular locations, the kind of how this honor killings is used in police stations, at the village level, et cetera, was not something that I looked at. But of course, Laila Abou-Lugod has done a great deal of work in looking at honor as a concept in Bedouin communities in Egypt. And her work really looks at how complicated it is as a structuring mechanism within social lives. But of course, it's a very structural way of looking at it, and there are, people like Mike Fisher and others argue with that way of looking at culture anyway. So there's a debate within the anthropology itself about how to think about honor as a central concept. Of course, it has a long history of anthropology and a long colonial history. Prem Chowdhury writes about this in case of Haryana. She tracks it through the kind of colonial formation of honor societies into more sort of post-colonial versions. My interest was to say, what happens when nobody talks about it for a while and suddenly it erupts in the popular media? So I wasn't sort of interested in sort of looking at the vernacular, the less mediated grounds as well. I was very interested in addressing, like, why is it that these newspapers are suddenly covering this topic and increasingly vocal about it? Why are they talking about it more and more articles? How does it become sort of hypertrophic in the media? So that was my interest, and so that was the sort of problematic that I entered into, rather than seeing it as an analysis of culture or a sort of historical thing. I was interested in media genres, transnational media circulations, and why sort of the analysis in India by feminists, by human rights workers, never speak about the kind of transnational context of it. Nobody, I know one article where somebody who's actually based in Britain writes about honor killings in India and connects it to the ones in the coverage in UK, but nobody does. So I was very interested in this sort of disconnect, that making the national local becomes a problem then. And you disconnect the national local from this broader transnational because you want to say that this is, to disavow the kind of most anti-Muslim sentiment within India as well. So I was just thinking of the political work that is done by these forms of production of media narratives as well. Now, the question of strategic essentialism, I've always been interested in, because I've always sort of wondered when essentialism is not strategic. So the concept has seldom sort of made any kind of sense to me. And also because I know Spivak said it, so it's got to be true. But at the same time, the question is always that everything is productive. Everything is useful. So this is very productive.
That you know, it is anti-hegemonic for the cup panchayats who are saying, okay, we use this honor, this is our culture, and we'll use it against you, urban, people sitting in Delhi. So they use it in an anti-hegemonic way, but I don't like the way they use it either. That is the problem, right? So the question is, then what is the politics? How do you think about politically what to do? And politically, what I was trying to do was to say we need to understand how this term circulates in a transnational framework, rather than, think. And I have, I've read some of the historical and the anthropological, but I'm really interested in what happens to our contemporary self-making of moderns. How are moderns been making? So that has been what I was interested in. And that sort of takes me to Sydney's question of sort of the kind of genres of reading, how we read. And we read, and I talk about certain genres: cinema, the crime show, the journalistic report, all of these as particular kinds of reading mechanisms, and that the kind of, and I don't show the images because I have tons of news reporting, because then that's another history that has to be then investigated. So I don't want to show that. But these are particular genres that are very, very powerful, and you gave some good examples of how it works. And so they're all, and there are, the interesting thing about even the suspect readings, the things that turn out to be hoaxes, that they never seem to shake the power of these narratives. That what happens is that they just, they shake them. I don't know how much they shake them even, because they seem to be turned out over and over again. I don't see the kind of journalism ever stopping. And there's a way in which new kinds of global moderns have to produce this Muslim other in some way that is now inevitably a very racialized Muslim other. That's how it's become differentiated in the US. It's a racial other now. It's not just a religious difference. How that is being produced. So that is an interesting thing. Now the question about e-witnessing I find really fascinating, because as we know, the internet culture has moved from thinking about it as a space that might be able to produce a commons, that might be able to have some openness, that might be able to provide some possibilities of some voices. But increasingly, the sort of, I would say, the corporatization and the control of it has shut down those spaces. That doesn't mean they've disappeared, but they've shut down those spaces. So some of the internet, the Web 2.0, it doesn't seem to have the promise that it had when we started thinking about the internet as a different place. And of course, people like Mark Poster have always thought of it as a super panopticon. So there's a lot of work on thinking about the internet as not some place outside or anything else. But what's interesting about it is those forms of participation that it has generated, and how the sorts of digital mechanisms of surveillance, for instance, the consumption, the sort of tracing of everything we do on the web has changed our relations to each other, so that private and public are all getting altered. What we disclose, what we don't disclose has changed. So all of that has happened as well. So one of the things that's happened as the newspapers have had, now they all have internet editions, right? All these news dailies exist in these transnational editions. And what's interesting is to look at the responses that come from all over. So those reading practices have incorporated diasporic others into a sort of national daily response mechanism that wasn't there before.
Interesting.
Right? So now now the question is whether that shakes the sort of hegemonic reading of it or whether it enforces it. And I would say some of it shakes it and some of it doesn't, because there are all kinds of people. But you do hear the most virulent casteism in these responses from like so-and-so Los Angeles, so-and-so, Detroit. They'll list their addresses to where they respond. And horrific stuff appears, as well as some good voices. So,
Can you share a microphone? Okay, we have time for just a couple of questions. Yeah, can I go in?
Okay. So the argument is made that the media creates stratification based on how it represents events such as honor killings through creating differences that are rather arbitrary based on like social caste and economic, vitality. And this does a couple of things. That distracts from the people who are making those arguments from interrogating their own systems of oppression. It also allows them to sell their articles better because they're already in the position of privilege when it comes to economic power. And then they can sell the things that people who are in those positions what they want to hear. And it also allows them to continue the patriarchal masculine domination within their caste by distracting that. But that also is an economic thing. So I guess my question is, it seems that all of these arguments lead to the same principle, that these are economically driven motives throughout, even if it ends up like manifesting itself culturally. So how do we address these issues because of these economic motives? Are we just interrogating like individual things, like trying to play catch up? Like capitalism has created this problem, so we're gonna fight it this way. Then we're gonna fight the next thing. How do we deal with this from the front basis, I guess is my question.
that's a really good question. Thank you. I think people are dealing with it in all kinds of ways to address the violence. I'm not going to say to address honor killings as a specific crime, because it's, I think, incorporated into larger frameworks of violence that exists in modern society. And one of the reasons I think why I think we need to investigate and think about this violence itself, because it continually produces different forms of inequality, subordination, et cetera, So we need to deal with this. But how to address violence and how to talk about it is the problem. And I think we've been talking about this the whole day, whether it's in, one way to deal with it is witnessing through photography, for instance, that we saw earlier today. So human rights becomes a way in which some people are thinking this is the best way to deal with it. But the question about economic rights has always been an issue within human rights discourses. For instance, the kind of question of economic rights has not been as powerful a concept within human rights organizations as is, for instance, political rights or other forms of rights as well. So one way to think about the economic is simply that, not that it's the most important thing, but it's an area where sort of it causes a lot of disruption, and to insist on this might provide some pushback as well. So I'd like to think about that as well. And the problem with thinking about, and in the US, in the West, what I think has motivated my paper is to think about that in order not to talk about patriarchy in the West, you find forms of, what's called pinkwashing, homophobia that's exported to other countries. All kinds of forms of violence within the country itself remain erased or disavowed. And those we need to kind of think about addressing. So thinking about, corporations as patriarchy might be kind of interesting to claim, right? But it is a way to push back at certain kinds of discourse, to say, I insist on something being looked at in a different framework, for instance. And that's what I'm trying to do.
Thank you for that very powerful paper. I've got a brief question that is in two parts. The first part is, I'm wondering about the extent to which the palatability and the persistent appetite for these narratives of honor killing in the West might be understood through their resonance with larger narratives of Muslim rage as a response to the perceived Western affronts to Muslim dignity. That is, to what extent might media accounts of the killing of an errant daughter, or for that matter, an outspoken Afghan schoolgirl, be seen as consonant with attacks on a Western embassy or the burning of a Dutch flag? The second part of the question then, which I think follows from that, is about the extent to which the forms of female subjectivity that are seen to provoke honor killings in these media accounts are coded or appropriated in these accounts as implicitly Western or modern in their affinity with the familiar lexicon of autonomy, self-determination, romantic attachment, or human rights, and what effects might these projections and identifications on the part of the Western writers of these accounts have when they reverberate back into Muslim communities.
Okay. I think the first question I didn't quite get. So you're asking if honor killing is a way to address the sort of the Muslim, no, the kind of rate. Can you say that?
So the question was just about I took part of the goal in the talk was to think about what makes these honor killing narratives so palatable, what accounts for their massive circulation and recirculation. And I was just wondering there about the resonance of those accounts with obviously the very prominent and marketable narratives about Muslim rage generally.
I think I was trying to do that. I didn't want to, I embedded my paper within a kind of construction of the way in which anti-Muslim arguments are made these days in the West, and very differently in India as well, because that's a different history. But they're all a way of continuing to think about the sort of problem of global terror as a Muslim issue, right? So in some way they do intersect with that whole argument that stabilizes violence as a cultural, ahistorical cultural form. That violence isn't produced by, that violence in Afghanistan has nothing to do with 50 years of war, that it's got to do with a primordial cultural form, right? So it's I think, very much about that. And I think your second question about how it gets appropriated as modern is really the problem of all of these narratives that could produced by these so many modern women who, to be modern has become, in some sense, to testify against your culture. So you produce a culture in some way that is outside you. And that seems to be really powerful. So people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali and all in an ongoing way, that narrative is very powerful. And it's very difficult to kind of address that and bring in a very complex scholarly apparatus to address that situation within the framework of journalism that is increasingly attenuated in what it produces, right? And so, yes. So I would say, and there are a whole bunch of other ways in which that happens. So sort of the very notion of Indian arranged marriages is a common one, for instance, another one.
Okay. Again, I have to be the one who ends the session. I want to thank our speaker and our discussants. Wonderful